I'll go ahead and just get started with the intro type stuff. Dean, it's really nice to meet you. I loved the book.
Thank you so much for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So I love the book so much. I thought I would at least illustrate the
Oh, wow.
high tech
Visual aids.
visual aids here. No, was something I found extremely impressive about the book was the use of visual aids. I mean, the cover alone, I think, is just so arresting, and that's got to be part of why it was a hit. So, do you mind if I start you off with just like a little? I'll say a little bit about the book and then ask you a couple of questions.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So I'm here talking to Dean Spears, an economist and demographer at the University of Texas at Austin. Dean did his PhD at Princeton. Is that right? With Angus Deaton.
Mhm. Angus Deaton and Katie Steph Hammer. Yeah.
Fantastic. And if anybody in the chat has any trouble hearing me, or Dean, let us know. We were tinkering with the settings a little bit. So I first heard about your terrific new book with Michael Caruso after the spike, because it was getting some buzz in among philosophers that I know, and I think rightly so. It's an incredible book that really takes the kind of standard narrative about population that overpopulation is a huge problem and the world's population is going to explode any day now, and really turns both of those theses on their heads. Like, one, the population is not going to keep going up and up and up and up. It's actually going to plummet. And two, that's bad. So I was just really impressed by that. Does that sound like a fair characterization of the main idea?
Well, absolutely. I mean, you said many kind things about the book. And yeah, so at the core of the book is a fact and a question. The fact is that global depopulation is the most likely future. And the question is whether depopulation is something that we should welcome or if we should instead work to have another future, for example, stabilizing the population at some level. So depopulation is the name for what's going to happen when each generation is smaller than the last. And fundamentally, the reason why it's so likely is that birth rates are low. And right now, the birth rate for the world as a whole is at 2.3 kids per two adults. And a little while after it goes below two kids per two adults, the next generation will be smaller than the last, and the size of the world population will shrink.
So I want to ask you about that number. So in your book,
Yeah.
you have a chapter 1 followed by a chapter 2.0. So why is 2.0 such an important number for you in your project?
Right. So the way that, we humans work, it takes, and the way that we make new people, it takes an average of two children per two adults to approximately stabilize the population. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Boys and girls aren't born in equal numbers, and not everybody lives to adulthood. So, like, the exact number of births that would stabilize the population depends on early life mortality rates. But in a future where early life mortality rates are likely to be low, meaning in a future where almost everyone lives to adulthood, then the number's likely to be close to two. But what we can really say is, just to make it easy, if the long-term average birth rate is below two, then the next generation is going to be smaller than the last. In the long run, the depopulation is going to be what happens next. And that's the trend we've been headed towards. One thing that surprises a lot of people is that we've seen the population growing exponentially. And, just as you said at the beginning, that led many people to believe that overpopulation is the most likely future, or more to the point, that the size of the population would just keep growing generation after generation. If something is growing, people thought it would keep growing. But this turns out to be an example of a mistake that judgment and decision-making psychologists call stock flow error. To think that when a stock, the number of people alive, is growing, it must be because the flow into it is growing, the number of births is growing. But in fact, all along, the birth rate has been falling as long as we have records for it. From a number like 6 worldwide at the beginning of the 1800s to maybe a number like 5.5 at the beginning of the 1900s. Of course, these are very, very approximate and, based on the best we can reconstruct from spotty records. But, the UN estimate started around 5 for the world as a whole in 1950, and it's at 2.3 today. And 2/3 of people now live in a country where the birth rate is below 2. What's particularly striking is that we don't really see any evidence of of big sustained reversals in countries where the lifelong birth rate has fallen meaningfully below two. And so all of these things make Mike and I think that, this collage of evidence points towards, birth rates are falling essentially everywhere. Rich countries, poor countries, middle income countries, more capitalist places, more socialist places, more religious places, more secular places, more progressive places, less progressive places. And for all of these reasons, that makes it pretty likely to think that falling birth rates are a likely future, and that, if so, it's sort of arithmetic that the size of the world population would begin to decline.
So when you say decline, how fast do you mean? Like, do you think that are you saying that the population is going to level off and then slowly erode, or I mean, how should we think about this?
There's no reason to think it's going to level off, right? I mean, level off is in some sense the alternative that we're calling for. I mean, a stabilization at some level, but because the logic of exponential growth, decline is the same as growth. Just with a different sign. The fall could be just as fast and just as exponential. So, one example is to think of a birth rate of 1.5. And, that's not outlandishly low. That's somewhere between Europe and the United States. Many U.S. states are below 1.5. East Asia is well below 1.5. So let's just imagine, what if the long-term birth rate for the world as a whole averaged out around 1.5? Then the world's population would decline by close to 10% per decade and around two-thirds per century. If that is sort of hard to put into context, think of it this way. Over the past 100 years, the size of the world population has quadrupled. And there's sort of no reason to think that a similar change like that, couldn't happen over a similar 100-year period. But the thing is, the growth that we've had has been because early life mortality rates have been falling close to zero, right? But they can't go past zero, right? The probability that a child dies can't be lower than zero. It's getting lower, and someday for the world as a whole, it'll be close to zero. And so that sort of process that brought us population growth, that's not going to happen again, right? We're not going to have a similar fall in mortality rates. But on the other hand, all that would be required for depopulation to continue worldwide would be for birth rates to stay low, right? So birth rates don't have to keep falling forever. If they go to something like 1.8, where it is in Latin America or Texas today, and stay there forever, then that would be sufficient to cause depopulation generation after generation.
So when did depopulation, or well, maybe be more precise here, when did birth rates start falling? Was this a recent phenomenon,
No,
or
not a recent phenomena. So that's what I say. The numbers are going down where we have evidence. When the UN World Population Prospects data starts in 1950, we see declines in the places where we have evidence before then. In France, it was at 3 at the beginning of the 20th century. So falling birth rates are nothing new. The one thing that you know is sort of an irony of all of this history is, Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, came out in 1968, where he was saying that, overpopulation is the most likely future, and, we're sort of going to be doomed to oblivion and starvation. And 1968 was already, ironically and coincidentally, the year in which the population growth peaked. And the population growth has been slowing ever since then, basically due to the same processes that are, falling birth rates that are going to eventually cause depopulation. So even since 1968, world population growth has been slowing. The only difference when we reach depopulation is going to be, the births cross the death and the population growth rate becomes negative. What's particularly striking is that, even in the decade after Ehrlich's book, already so many countries and places around the world were falling below this two kids per two adults threshold. European countries, Canada, Japan, Cuba, Australia, these are places that were falling below two, even in the 70s. So by 1980, already one-fifth of people lived in a country where the birth rate was below two.
already a fifth? That's incredible. That actually, this brings me to a question that someone asked in the comments, which is,
Mhm.
what were people thinking that were so afraid of overpopulation? I mean, I was very impressed by and convinced by the just shellacking of Ehrlich's work in the book.
Yeah.
Um, but it wasn't just, of course, one guy. I mean, as you say in the book, his book sold millions of copies.
Right.
Um, so what were people like him and the people buying those books
I
convinced
mean, I
of?
think, one thing is this stock flow bias we talked about, where, people, if they see the stock growing, it must be that the flow into it is large. I also, think that population science has advanced since then. Like, we know more than we used to. In part, we have data sets that we didn't used to have. So it's still the case that many people around the world live in countries that don't have vital registration. Like birth certificates, like all births and deaths are registered. But that's been improving. And what we have now that we didn't have before in lots of places is survey data. So, like, especially since the 1980s, when the World Fertility Survey and the Demographic and Health Surveys came online, we would collect representative sample survey data. It doesn't register every birth and death, but it asks women, questions about retrospective birth history. So, like, when did you first give birth? When did you say? So we didn't have that sort of data, and we frankly didn't have the computers to analyze. So, I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is we don't need to, like, point a finger of culpability necessarily. Population science has improved. We've gotten better at asking people about how many children they want to have. But I mean, yes, it is the case that even then, there were long trajectories of recording vital rates for richer countries. Sweden, we have data going back centuries. Many European countries, we have long-term data. So, the trend of low birth rates definitely is something that more people could have noticed and talked about even 50 or 60 years ago. And part of the project of the book is that even though the depopulation isn't projected to start for 6 decades from now by the UN, other times by other demographers, to start talking in advance so that this isn't something that sneaks up on us and we sort of have the time to make a good and thoughtful decision.
That sounds really compelling to me. When you say that, we're going to get the ball rolling, I mean, do you think that we know now what the solutions are? Or, I mean, let me just throw a couple of examples at you. So, would one solution be to increase longevity, or maybe to have immigration from countries with higher birth rates to countries with lower birth rates? Do you think those?
Well,
Would you
I mean,
say?
I'll sort of As a quick overview, I don't think anybody has all the answers to this. I think it's too new an emerging talent. I mean, on the topic of longevity, of course, I hope that we are able to make people live longer, but I don't think that's going to be all by itself what avoids depopulation, because how long people live is just going to change the stock of the population size. So, I mean, to talk that through, like, right now, let's say people live to an average of 75 years, and let's say we manage to double that, so people live to an average of 150 years. That's, of course, going to have a bump in the size of the population, because, there are going to be more people alive at those older adult ages. But if those people who are living to be 150 still have an average of 1.8 kids per two adults, then cohort after cohort, generation after generation is still going to shrink exponentially. It would be shrinking exponentially from a larger number. And so now, if whatever this magic is that causes us to live twice as long also, like, expands our fecundable ages, makes us gives us the option to have more children, and people choose to do so. So maybe you have two kids in your 30s and raise them, and then have two kids in your 60s or something. Like, if that's the future, then that would avoid depopulation. But it would be because people were having more children, not because older adults were dying later.
So, even doubling longevity
Exactly.
wouldn't be enough. That's
Now, if
that's pretty
you
impressive.
continuously, exponentially increased how long people lived, right, then that would do it. Otherwise, it's just a level there. Yeah.
Okay.
And there was another one you asked about. We can do them
Immigration.
all, but yeah.
Yeah, no. I think like the book just sets them up and knocks them down in a very compelling way. And I've noticed that the same few come up when I tell people about the book.
Mhm.
So immigration is the other one,
Right.
kind of alongside the thought that, well, surely depopulation is going to be happening in some rich countries, but not everywhere.
Right.
And won't the Amish or the Nigerians or
Right.
name
Yeah,
some
yeah.
countries with
No,
higher?
it's good for you to connect the Amish and the immigration thing.
Okay.
So I mean, on the level of immigration, right? So, of course, any one given country can avoid depopulation by having people move to it from other places. The world as a whole, that won't work because people don't move on or off the world in important numbers. But in the long term, um, immigration couldn't stop global depopulation. Um, as long as essentially every country or the place where migrants come from are falling below replacement rates. Now, almost every region right now is below replacement. Not every region. The big exception is sub-Saharan Africa. That's at 4.3 now, having fallen from an average around 6 a few decades ago. So yes, Africa is above 2. No, it's not an exception to the trend of falling birth rates. Birth rates are falling there too. And what's important is that, there are good reasons why the demographers and population scientists at places like the UN expect birth rates in Africa to keep falling. Basically, there's a lot of room left for socioeconomic development to, improve things like female education, female secondary school attendance, female literacy, all the things that we know, higher living standards, lower poverty, lower infant mortality, are associated with bringing birth rates down. So as like a rough stylized fact, female secondary education in sub-Saharan Africa is kind of like what it was in a place like, the northern Hindi heartland plains of India a few decades ago. And the birth rate there in Africa is kind of like what it was in sort of the northern plains Hindi heartland of India a few decades ago. But as socioeconomic development, especially literacy and education, improve there, birth rates fall. And we'd expect that to happen in Africa too. It would be a real exception to what we see everywhere else. It doesn't happen in Africa. Now, the Amish, sort of a similar story. Like people ask these questions. So Africa is one. Maybe Africa is going to be the place where birth rates stay above 2. But that would be surprising. Okay, fine. Maybe the Amish are going to be the population where birth rates stay above 2. Or maybe the Mormon. Oh, yes, but the birth rate in Utah is actually now below 2, like in every other U.S. Or maybe it's the Quebecois Catholics that are going to take over the world with their populace. Now, what am I talking about? You've never thought about the Catholics of Quebec? Um, but it's the similar sort of example as the Amish, in that it's a population that in the 20th century, in the mid 20th century, had very high birth rates. I mean, it wasn't uncommon to see families of, say, 9 children. And, my co-author, Mike Girusso, is descended from one of those families. But the Catholics of Quebec have not taken over the world with their high birth rates because birth rates there have fallen, and that's why we don't know that story as well. In other words, we can't just cherry pick the populations where birth rates have stayed high to learn about what's likely. And in fact, even if you look at the Amish in particular, birth rates have been falling amongst the Amish. And of course, here's something that's subtle that people miss. When I say birth rates have been falling amongst the Amish, I mean birth rates have been falling amongst the children and grandchildren who have stayed Amish and not left, right? You have to compute into the average, which nobody really knows, the people who have strayed from the fold, which would bring down the average overall. So even only looking at the staters, birth rates have fallen amongst the Amish. And so is any one group's birth rates going to take over the whole world? That would require that group to stay cohesive as a group, generation after generation after generation after generation, and keep birth rates above 2. And that's something that we just don't see a lot of evidence of. Of course, it's a mathematical possibility, but it's a mere mathematical possibility.
Okay. I mean, it's just so fascinating that this is it just empirically the same pattern shows up everywhere. That even where birth rates are high, it's just watch your
Yeah, I mean,
watch.
even India, for example. I mean, I do my research mainly in India, especially northern India, like Uttar Pradesh. And Uttar Pradesh is a pretty disadvantaged place. But young women there tell surveyors that they want an average of 1.9 children. And India as a whole, Ehrlich, talking about Ehrlich's population bomb book, he starts out, being scared of the way he puts it is people, 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 people in the, center interior of Old Delhi. India was really the center of these overpopulation fears in the 20th century, but India too is now a below replacement birth rate population. So, a world in which, so the fact that young women in Uttar Pradesh want an average of 1.9 children matters for its own sake, matters for them, matters for their own lives. And it also tells us that a world where that's true is a world where a lot of people are wanting fewer children. Sometimes we hear these stories that it also sort of helps tell us that there's no one explanation, no one headwind against parenting that covers everything. So we hear stories that the reason birth rates are low is that people aren't getting married or having sex anymore. But marriage remains almost universal in these parts of India, typically arranged marriages. People do tend to, childlessness rates remain low. People do tend to have one kid or two kids, and then have permanent contraception surgery, sterilization, tubal ligation, and not have more kids. And so, if you think that the explanation is people not getting married, well, that's not India, and India is the world's most populous below replacement birth rate country. If you think that I've heard people talk about it's because of the sort of the messages of mobile phones or the internet or something like that. But it's true when you look amongst young women in a place in Uttar Pradesh in the most recent demographic survey that people who have never used mobile phones or never used the internet say that they want a few more kids on average than people who have. But for both the ones who have and one who haven't, they're wanting below replacement birth rates on average, and the difference is pretty small. And so I'm getting sort of into some weeds here, but what all of these weeds tell us when you zoom back from them is that any sort of explanation or theory that somebody has about, my variable of interest is what explains falling birth rates is something we can find, important counterexamples to. So the through line is really that this is a convergent global phenomenon that's happening in a lot of different countries, been happening for a long time, and the birth rates in different places are becoming more similar.
This is fascinating. Can I ask you now? We've got the kind of basics of the book out there.
Go for it.
Can I ask you some other questions, and then we'll come back
Absolutely.
around at the end to subscribers. So
I can chant numbers as long as you'll let me, but
I will. Don't tempt me. I'll do it. But I have to ask. So the book has been a bit of a smash from what I've seen, and in our correspondence, it sounded like maybe everybody hopes that the book will take off, but maybe, well, what's it been like? I've seen you've been doing the rounds on all these different podcasts and so on. Did you expect this reaction at all, or has it surprised you in any way?
I mean, we definitely tried to write a book that people would want to read. There were many, many times when Mike and I did a little computation. If we, work on this for another hour and X many people read it, then that'll be X many hours in which somebody can read something. We kept ourselves motivated the way you might think economists would. But yeah, we made the decision not to write an academic book with an academic press and to try to write something that would feel accessible to people, and I hope that we did.
Yeah, I think you definitely did, for what it's worth. Were there any models for you as you were writing this? Because I know you've written tons of academic stuff, but like, who did you look to write something else?
I think like part of the idea that we could write a book like this came from Angus Deaton's book The Great Escape. That was something we sort of had in front of us or in our minds, and I'm sort of influenced by these old classics of development studies like Ferguson's Anti-Politics Machine or Everybody Loves a Good Drought.
I've never heard of these.
Yeah, there. So I mean, in other words, so if I mean, you've seen the book. Maybe not everybody listening has. There's sort of a bit of a dialogue between what the statistics tell us and then sort of the stories, especially of my work in India. We see this kangaroo mother care ward where I've worked with over time. So, like, we wanted to write a book that sort of went back and forth in stories and statistics with that. When we were talking about population ethics, we sort of, one of the things that we had in front of us was thinking about Peter Singer's writing, like in The Life You Can Save or Family Affluence and Morality, try to sort of not, if you've seen my research papers, you know that I like Greek letters and representation theorems, but to try to say things without Greek letters and representation theorems, yeah, there's uh, a lot of people who've done it before and have done it better than we did. But I do hope that if nothing else, people come away, challenging any sort of certainty they might have had about overpopulation, at least open to the idea that depopulation might not be a future to welcome by default, and if it, at least be asking.
That was definitely my reaction. But when did you first think this was a huge problem?
Well, I mean, I have been sort of my own research has been sort of I was going to say a dialogue, but not always a dialogue, maybe two parallel streams, I suppose, between sort of empirical demography and, questions about population and well-being, for a very long time. Um, I remember, you know, I don't know, well over a decade ago, being in, the Jeep with the survey team. And I think this particular moment I have in mind is in Rajasthan, going to villages to ask people about their toilets and open defecation. And, reading, um, you know, for the first time, Parfit's Reasons and Persons, on a Kindle, while the Jeep is sort of bumping up and down over these roads. And I remember my spouse Diane asking, again, well over a decade ago, as we were sort of walking back from, I don't know, maybe a day where she was at the district hospital, um, you know, um, uh, being with women as they gave birth, and talking about sort of neonatal mortality and cases where a baby dies, and because of that, the mom has another birth, and how should we think about that? And so, to me, the questions of empirical demography. Okay, let me say something else. I think for a lot of my colleagues in population science, the lessons that they learn from the overpopulation, derelict, population control debacle is that there is no such thing as good or bad. It's sort of like an extreme libertarianism about birth rates, so I think the demography community looks at the coercion and harm, something like the emergency under Indira Gandhi in India, where there were forced sterilizations, or the one-child policy in China, or the opposite that, Decree 770 in Ceausescu's Romania, and says, we, the professional demography community, were sort of more than complicit in this. In some cases, we were actors in this. People affiliated with Office of Population Research at Princeton, where I did my studies. And of course, that's not the people who are there today. This is, older generations. And so the lesson that so many in the demography community came with, part of our professionalism as population scientists is that we don't talk about normative issues other than that everybody should have the freedom and the tools they need to choose to be a parent or to choose not to be a parent. And of course, I agree that everybody should have the freedom and the tools they need to choose to be a parent or to choose not to be a parent. But I don't think that's the only sentence that we should say about it. I think that there are other questions that matter too. But what's sort of an intellectual tension that I feel like this community hasn't wrestled with enough is so many of these people also believe, now I think incorrectly, but also believe that climate change would be a reason to work for a smaller population. Um, and so the way that many in the international development community have sort of squared the circle is to think of it as just like a happy coincidence, that if we you know give everybody, if we, promote complete freedom, people will choose to have fewer children, and that will be good for the climate. Um, um, one hiccup that emerges in that thinking is that in many low birth rate populations, people tell surveyors that they wish they had more children than they have. So it's sort of a stylized fact from places like the United States, where birth rates are low, that people tell surveyors, maybe they have one kid and they say, ideally, I would have liked to have two. Now, that's really complicated, and we can talk about whether we should believe those data. When someone says, I would ideally like to have two kids, what exactly they mean by that ideal. All of which is to say, um, um, you know, one of the projects we're trying to do with this book is to say that we can believe the following two things at the same time. One is, yes, let's no, let's support people's decisions about what families to choose for themselves and not tell people what to do, and certainly not use the power of the state to coerce people into having more children or fewer children. And there, might be matters of externalities or public goods that, matter for all of us, whether it's, environmental damage or economic progress or just the value in a good life being lived, things on both sides of the equation that make us think that the size of the overall birth rate could have implications for people beyond the family. I actually think that's kind of like a non-surprising claim, right? We might disagree about like how it has those implications, but I think like if I were to just sort of like ask my sisters, like, does it matter for society as a whole how many babies are born? They would say like, yes, of course, right?
Yeah.
Um, and okay, so I'll pause there.
The image of a demographer reading Parfit, while on the job is a very striking one. That I could see how
I
that
think most demographers probably don't do their work from Jeeps and Uttar Pradesh, but yeah.
and that's another big feature in the book. If you haven't read it, anyone listening, like the stories about the kangaroo mother care ward are really, I thought, eye opening and interesting. So can I, I also like this idea that sometimes you correct too far in the other direction. You uh, instead of saying, yeah, we went too far with anti overpopulation measures. You go to sort of normative nihilism. Um, that doesn't sound exactly proportionate. Um, but you mentioned also climate change. So
Mhm.
this is how I came across your work for the very first time. Actually, was your paper on this. So like, I can't help but ask you. Would you mind just like explaining why why shouldn't we be welcoming depopulation in order to prevent climate change?
So this is something that I've been lucky enough to work with a group of people, the Climate Futures Initiative, that do these quantitative integrative assessment models, where you're matching an economic model with with model of the atmosphere and the environment to sort of be able to say at once, if sort of society is on this path, how is that going to interact with the climate? So I've learned a lot from people like Mark Rudolphson, Noah Skowronek, Frank Erickson, Mark Flerbet, Kevin Kurek. So I just want to say this, nobody knows everything, and yeah. But so if we want to talk about um, why, whether depopulation is something to welcome to relieve us of our climate challenge. I think the first thing we need to talk about is timing, and the fact that that decarbonization is simply too urgent relative to a depopulation that's projected to begin 6 decades from now, in the 2080s. So the UN puts it in the 2080s, right? Which means that the size of the world population, really, no matter what we do now, is likely to keep growing for decades. And so if you think that depopulation is going to be what gets us off the hook, it's just not on the right time scale. If you have a kid today, that kid will be deciding whether or not to have kids in maybe 20 or 30 years or more. by that time, that, puts us back well past things like 2050 climate deadlines. It's just not going to happen fast enough. The population is too slow turning of a big ship relative to the speed of our climate challenges. And so nobody should be thinking that depopulation starting decades from now is going to be a substitute that gets us off the hook for the decarbonization that we need to do urgently. Now, I say that, and I think, a lot of people sort of a reaction to that is, well, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, right? You've persuaded me that nothing that's going to happen in 2080 is going to be what solves our climate challenges. But, in the fight against the environment, um, or
Yeah,
sorry, in the
yeah, yeah.
fight against climate
The
change, fight
mask
to
is
save the
off.
environment.
Yeah.
Either way, right?
Yeah.
In the fight against climate change, every little bit helps, right?
Right.
And so, wouldn't a smaller population help now? But even so, this we just get back to just how slowly the population can change. So one of the things that we do in a research paper that we talk about in the book is take the most likely path that the population's on, where peaks and then declines, and then say like, what is the sort of fastest outwardly plausible thing you could consider, where the population would instead stabilize at a larger level with birth rates starting going up even very soon, right? And so again we get back to stocks and flows. So even if birth rates started going up very soon, it wouldn't change the size of the population for decades. So yes, even a path that could create a difference of billions of people out 100 or 150 years from now would result in a pretty small difference between the two population paths for the next few decades. And the reason that matters is the next few decades is the time when emissions per person are going to be the highest. Even on a pretty pessimistic decarbonization path, where we don't finish emitting net carbon emissions for another 100 years or so, um, a, a, that difference in the population is going to cause a teeny tiny difference in the overall amount of carbon emissions in the atmosphere, because it's going to be a teeny tiny difference in population size until such time as emissions per person are pretty small.
That I find.
Like literally less than 0.10 of a degree of peak temperature, or point 0.1 of a degree of peak temperature from like an implausibly huge difference in the population. Sorry, go on.
So no, no, that's
Mm,
perfect. So the
mm.
less than 0.1 degrees, if we go absolutely ham on it. That's yeah. So it's not the silver bullet for climate. Far from it.
Now, of course, there
Yeah.
have been times when humanity has made progress against environmental challenges, and it has never been by shrinking the population.
Right.
Uh, so, one of the things that we talk about is the particulate air pollution challenge in China, where in 2013, air pollution in China was, so bad that the U.S. embassy rated it as a 700 on a scale of 500. Newspapers around the world called it the air apocalypse. And there's sort of particle pollution in the air is really terrible for children's health and development and for older adult mortality. So, we should understand this to be pretty big challenge. And so that was in 2013, this air apocalypse. And what happened next? Well, one thing that happened next is that the size of the population in China grew by more than 50 million people. And that's a lot. And that's, something like Canada or Spain, more than Texas, right? And so you might expect then that particulate air pollution in China got a lot worse if, more people or more environmental challenges. But in fact, particulate air pollution in China fell by more than half. And it's not just China, for the world as a whole, not in India, unfortunately, but for the world as a whole, particulate air pollution has been improving even as the population has been growing. And how is that possible? Oh, once I say it like that, it's pretty clear that it's because people are doing something else, and these people are doing different behaviors. And the government in China reacted to this problem and implemented and enforced regulations. On industry, on power plant, shut down coal power plants, so that people emitted less particulate pollution. every time we've ever made progress against our environmental challenges before, whether it's, the ozone hole in the 1980s, where, we made progress with the Montreal Protocol that banned CFCs, not by shrinking the population, whether it's leaded gas in the 1970s, where we had the Clean Air Act, whether it's acid rain in the 1990s, where the Clean Air Act was amended to regulate sulfur dioxide. We have made progress against environmental challenges in the past while the population has been growing, and that's by, you know, changing what people do, implementing new technologies, implementing regulations, enforcing them. And, that's the playbook, and that's what we need to do again.
Makes sense. Um, can I ask you a little bit about why? I mean, we've sort of circled around this. Why is the birth rate falling? And one thing you say is that it's the choices we're making,
Right.
right? So I've been thinking about this because my wife and I are doing IVF, and
Mhm.
I
Good
think,
luck.
thank
We
you.
did it twice. It didn't work.
We've had ups and downs. Trust me. It
Mhm.
turns out we're both carriers for cystic fibrosis, which
Mm.
is a bit of a pain, but also like what amazing technology we have so that we can.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think about like my own case. I would love to have multiple kids, and my wife
Yeah.
is the only child and doesn't want to. I mean, if we had just one kid, we'd love it, of course, but we'd like to have the child who has a sibling. And I think why don't I have kids? And in my own case, I feel like, well, I was busy. I mean,
Mm.
like
Mhm.
I was going to school,
Mhm.
and I think I would have been shamed if I'd had, if I tried to get married before going to college, or even during college. And certainly, in grad school, I felt like I was supposed to grind it out. Not, and some people do have children in philosophy PhD programs, but there's definitely I feel like a lot of pressure people put on themselves to focus and not think about family until much later. Um, but I don't know. I mean, is that just maybe that seems true for me and maybe some other people in the United States or Australia, but I don't know if that's true around the world. Like, so I'll mention a couple of things I said just now was like education and also like stigmatization of getting, sort of hitched too young.
Mhm.
I mean, do you think of these as important factors, or do we not know yet?
Yeah, I think you're right that this matters for a lot of people, and you're right that it's different stories and for different places and different people. And this is something that Mike and I thought about a lot of, not wanting to sort of over generalize from, people like us and people we know, um, to the challenges, to the headwind, to the multiple headwinds that a lot of other people would face. So, I mean, I think for a lot of people, the story you tell is right, where people are, doing education, getting started on their careers. They feel like there's important work to do, and they don't start trying to have a family until, they're old enough that the age decline and fecundability is a challenge for them. Definitely part of my family's story and definitely part of Mike's family story. But when you look at data like the National Survey of Family Growth, there aren't that many women in the U.S. in their 40s who say that they would like to have more children than they do. They are there, and again, we have to think hard about like the exact social situation of how you answer your survey question and what you're thinking about when you answer it.
Right.
But I mean, statistically, you know, there aren't. There aren't that many. I mean, another way of looking at it is if you compare across country cohorts. So groups of people born at the same time in different countries. So like, look at the people born in the United States in 1980. Look at the people born in France in 1975. Look at the people born wherever. Um, the number of children that people say they want to have is a really good predictor on average of the number of children people that people end up having. No, that doesn't mean everybody gets exactly what they want. That's
Right.
never the case in parenting and life. And no, it doesn't mean that you get it at the exact age people want, people that have their kids at the exact age they want. But on average, the number of kids people say they want is a pretty good predictor of the number of children people have. And so I think, setting aside sort of the example I already gave of, like India, where people are having their kids young, and still having below replacement birth rates. I think even looking just within a society like the United States, I think there aren't that many people like us. Here's sort of a thought experiment that first emerged sort of live on stage at a philosophy event. I know a lot of the people here in the philosophy community. This was at a thing at Oxford, where we said, well, imagine there were a baby button, and you could push the button and you would get a baby for you to love and take care of and be frustrated with and clean up after and stick with for long years and long nights, and be a parent of this kid for the rest of your life. And if you push the baby button, the baby just appears. So there's no infecundability, there's no miscarriage, there's no being pregnant, there's no hyperemesis, there's no childbirth, there's no bodily trauma and risk of childbirth. And so, for many people, that would be wonderful. I mean, I think my spouse and I would have, gosh, it's hard to say. I mean, had some sort of event like a wedding where we pushed the button in front of all the people who we love most, and it would have been like the happiest moment. I get overwhelmed thinking about it. But, the question is, for how many people would really push the button and have more children than they otherwise would have? And when you think about it like that, it sort of draws out that yes, getting pregnant and being pregnant and giving birth is one big set of challenges. And once the baby's born, there are a lot of other ways that being a parent or being a parent of an extra kid is going to change your lives that are going to matter a lot for this decision. And so maybe few people would just push the button over and over again. So I think that thought experiment helps us see the multiple headwinds against having lots of children, whatever they are, in different people's lives, and that um, sort of fertility in the medical sense and infecundability is yes very important in a lot of people's lives, but probably not what's shaping global low birth rates.
Right. Well, and also implicit in that thought experiment is it's not just the hassle of pregnancy itself, you think, right?
Right. Yeah, it's you got the kid afterwards,
Yeah.
which let me be very clear, also has its advantages.
Yeah. I I can't help you're very scrupulous in the book about not throwing out hypotheses that really don't match with the data and so on. But I kind of want to just run through a few other hypotheses and just see what you think. And I won't hold you to it if you have hunches or something. So I mean, one thing you discuss in the book is that maybe the opportunity costs of having a child go up as other things in life get really good. Like this is also an explanation of loneliness. Maybe as Netflix and Nintendo Switch 2 get better, hanging out with your friends in person, it's not that it intrinsically gets worse, but it just, you're missing out of more stuff on the couch. And then, but, and yeah, so that's one possibility. Another possibility, I don't remember this coming up in the book, is that like you just have less to gain from your children. So like if you're working in a big farming community, your kids might like do very necessary labor for you, or you might have, like rely on them because there's no state to take care of you in your old age or when you're sick. But now uh, the state will take care of you in a lot more countries, and children might feel culturally like validated to be independent, and there's just no guarantee that your kid's going to like stick around and watch after you. um, So I don't know, like, do you think that the costs to benefit? I mean, that's an example, like foregone benefits of having a child. Then be the
Yeah,
benefits.
and I'm smiling just now because I can't like control what my 6-year-old does at the hour level, let alone at the decade level. But, um, um, I mean, okay, so I'll do those sort of in reverse order.
Getting a lot of likes for that, by the way.
I mean, to the idea, so this is sort of the old like Caldwell wealth flows theory of fertility decline. That like in poorer, high birth rate societies, the benefits flow from children to parents. As socioeconomic development happens, benefits flow from parents to children. You know, I'm I'm going to be agnostic and say like for the decline from an average birth rate of 5 to an average birth rate of 2.3, that could have been really very important. I think what that probably doesn't help us very much with is the question of why the birth rate in Sweden fell from 1.7 or 1.8 a decade ago to around 1.4 or 1.5 today. Like, I think the fact that we're continuing to see falling birth rates, even in, pretty rich populations where like there hasn't been major revolutions in the welfare state or the economy, tells us that, this theory, it could have been really important at a certain point of economic development and may still be in some places, but probably isn't what's explaining the fall to lowest low birth rates today. The other thing you brought up about opportunity costs, you know, so just to take a step backwards for a second, that's sort of economics professor jargon for whatever you give up to get something. So, you can't have your cake and eat it too. The opportunity cost of eating your cake is continuing to have it. And the opportunity cost of you know of being a parent is whatever you would otherwise get and do and enjoy and suffer and experience, that you're not going to, because you have a kid or another kid. And so a few minutes ago I said something like this is really the low and falling birth rates is a convergent phenomenon that we're seeing in lots of societies around the world, that places are becoming more similar in their birth rates as time goes on, and so we should be thinking of something that is sort of happening in a lot of places and pushing the whole world in a similar direction. And so one thing that you say when you bring up opportunity costs is in a whole lot of ways life is getting better for a lot of people in a lot of places, and I sort of understand that that's a weird and passe and old man thing to say. We're supposed to think that the world is horrible and getting worse. But especially when I think about like the place that I study in Uttar Pradesh, and I see birth rates going down. More people having toilets, not as fast as I would like. Children growing taller, not as fast as I would like. Infant mortality, more people surviving, not as fast as I would like. And there are a lot of ways that the world is getting better in lots of places, and so whatever it is that's competing with having a kid is probably getting better. Now, on the other hand, a lot of the joys and benefits of having a kid are probably staying approximately the same. Like, I sort of sometimes like to talk about like a kid waking me up in the middle of the night to tell me if they threw up in their bed, and you know I've got a washing machine now that I can put that whole thing into a washing machine. And that's a lot better. And like I'm rich enough that I have like extra sheets, right? I can take
Yeah.
those sheets off and put other sheets on. And that's not been true of everybody every win. And so that's a lot better. And as important as those things are, I submit that the basic experience of getting woken up by a pukey kid, and the hug snuggle and the satisfied breathing at the end that you hear when your kid goes back to sleep, it's probably all kind of similar,
Yeah.
to what it would have been before. Yeah. So that's the theory, and that's the closest Mike and I come to giving an account. I'll turn right around now and say there's something unsatisfyingly tautological about saying increasing opportunity costs is the explanation. I mean, from like a revealed preference point of view in economics, like if that's what people are choosing, then it's almost unsatisfyingly tautological to say so, because whatever the opportunity cost is that's relevant for you might be different from the opportunity cost that's relevant for me. And I think it's possible that, for example, in India, where remember, female labor force participation is still pretty low in international comparison. So it's not this like career family conflict that we see in other places.
Right.
It's not delayed education. Maybe there the relevant opportunity cost is more about the old classic story of having more resources to invest in each child's human capital. Um, I don't know, sort of at the point that we say what the opportunity cost is to kids, that's a great big researcher degree of freedom in our explanation. But this is this is, I think, early days to some extent in understanding this. It's still the case that a lot of people who I talk with think that overpopulation is the path we're on, and so it's okay to not have all the answers. I think, and I mean, if if um,
Who
if
says
what
that?
happens next is that a bunch of people go out there and write their dissertations and job market papers saying that, Dean is silly and actually it's this explanation, then I would be delighted.
Great. This is helping me kind of get a picture of like what you're calling for when you're calling for like more attention to be paid to the problem. But I can't help but pick up on this. What who still believes in the overpopulation being imminent? Is it people in your field or is it people in adjacent fields?
I think it's more people outside of scholarship. Well, I mean, I think I don't think that. I mean, so I guess in I think it was 2012. There was a paper in Science when the first UNWPP projections came out that had like statistical confidence intervals around them. Like how likely, sort of the new sort of invention of being able to put Bayesian probabilistic forecasting. And the title of the paper was something like "Population Stabilization Unlikely This Century." And what they meant from this point of view of 2012 was like the immediate slope at the year 2100 was going to be positive, right? Which is sort of a weird thing to make your summary headline. When like, yeah, it would be positive, but really tiny, right? And probably going to decline down. And of course, since then, subsequent revisions of the world population prospects have said no, birth rates are falling faster than our projections than we're thinking, and now we do think so. So that's the point of view from. I guess I'm telling that story to say like the old idea of positive population growth took a long time to die out. And, then the UN got there faster than, for example, the Social Security Administration, which, until pretty recently, the most recent updates towards the end of the Biden Harris administration were projecting like their middle case is that the total fertility rate you would like and back up to two and like
Really?
stabilize back out at two. I mean, you could have a cynical view and say that there's something convenient if it's your job to make the spreadsheets about the Social Security Administration, that the birth rates are going to go up to two, or you could just sort of say like that's just in some sense a belief in what's natural, right? That this,
Right.
but of course now that's no longer the case. Now the projections are that it'll fall below two. So, so I mean, part of it is just if you spend your career thinking about positive population growth, you're probably going to continue to think so. But honestly, I do think that the demography community has seen this coming for, you know, not decades, but years, right? I think like the bigger set of people who need to update is just sort of the general public who think that We have positive population growth. Our whole life it's been positive population growth. It's going to continue to be positive.
Dean, thank you for all these terrific answers. Before you go, can I give you a few questions from people that have submitted?
Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. I've got I've got a bunch of nitpicky in the weeds questions about the repugnant conclusion, but I'll email you those and you can archive those
Okay,
if
I
you'd
would
like.
be happy to do that if you wanted, but
Uh,
well, I don't know if everyone here knows what we'll be talking about, but I would only, in fact, if I'll say like,
uh,
I really hoped that there would be more talking about, sort of the question of whether more people living good lives is better. As sort of, I'm optimistic that we're not there yet, and as sort of more people read the book and start considering this question, sort of orienting themselves anew as the question, sort of realize that's a question to consider. But it hasn't come up in the interviews as much as I would. So so
well,
feel free. Is what I'm saying.
okay, let's talk about that a little bit then. Because so I one question about the book is it pessimistic or is it optimistic? And in a way, it seems obviously pessimistic, like there's a spike and we're about to go down the spike, and a bunch of things in the world will change, and there'll be less innovation, and we won't be able to finance, the fixed costs of various important endeavors, like if there's solving climate change, for example. You give other examples of disasters, like maybe there's an asteroid we need to nudge away. Um,
Something that we need to sort of buy once and for all, like the
but
formula for a COVID vaccine, that we'll be more likely to find it when there are more other people.
I so how about this? It's pessimistic if we go down the spike and can't afford the once and for all better for humanity purchases. But I also found the book deeply optimistic because it
Mhm.
made me feel it was one of the few things I've read in a while that was really saying it's good if there's more people.
Mm.
Um, so
And life is good, right? I mean, the whole chapter 5 that also sort of doesn't. We're saying no. We think like life is getting better around them. Yeah.
have you come across like the anti-natalist philosophy? Like people arguing that it's more like immoral to bring kids into existence. For one thing, they'll say stuff like, they fuck you up, your mom and dad. They'll quote poetry, or they'll say, you can't get consent from a merely possible being that doesn't exist. Um, and so you're inflicting harm because there's gonna be some harms down the road. But so I don't know. Have you encountered this stuff? Because I think it's got quite outsized influence in philosophy and ethics.
I don't feel like I have a whole lot intelligent to say about it. I'd be happy to, so if you could ask me more specifically.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
doesn't really resonate. I understand that a core idea is that it is sort of closely related to this sort of asymmetry type idea that like the badnesses count and the goodnesses don't. But not like, one way would be thinking about that as sort of like at a person level, that like it's bad to create a person who has a bad life and not good to create a person who has a good life. My understanding is that one view out there is that even within a life, the badnesses or the suffering sort of count as a reason, um, that makes things worse, and the goodnesses don't count. And I find that very impossible. Like, I mean, I agree it's a view you can state, but I find that very impossible.
yeah. So back in like the mid 20th century, there was this view kicking around of negative utilitarianism. You might have heard of, where it's like the asymmetry for possible people, but for everything. Where I have no particular obligation to give you a cookie, even if you'd like it, but I may not, cause you pain.
Or to eat a cookie if I'm holding it and I would like it. Like, I have no reason to eat the cookie if I'm holding it and I would like it.
No, sometimes they put it in terms of obligation, but they would. You don't have to eat the cookie, but people quickly notice that this would immediately imply that you should extinguish life on Earth, right? Because the
Right.
no reason to promote people's happiness,
And
but you
and I guess it's wrong not to, right?
well, I think rather than face that, they just gave up on negative utilitarianism. But the kind of descendant of that still lives, I think, somewhere deep in our psyches, and certainly in population ethics, is this procreation asymmetry.
Mhm.
Um, But I don't know. I found the book like hugely convincing that like just even forgetting about possible people, the actual world really depends on on a huge population. I mean, do you want to talk a little bit more about?
Yeah, I
Well,
mean, so I think that's really important. So like I think a lot of the population ethics that like we here in 2025 have like received from people who were writing in the 70s and 80s when a lot of the important ideas and theorems came about, um, were from people who were writing under the shadow of this overpopulation concern. Like it was just sort of empirically given, that a more populous world would be a worse world per person. Thinking of maybe some of the things that Sculptor wrote, but certainly there are some things and reasons and persons that have this flavor. Um, and so like you can see how somebody would sort of ask the question of the repugnant conclusion, if if a larger population would be worse per person, but still have more goodness overall, isn't there something repugnant about saying that could be better? And so, like these hard questions of population ethics, in many cases, feel like they're all about this trade-off between quality and quantity. Here's sort of the per person well-being versus total number of people. And so, one of the things that we're trying to say in this book is guess what? That's not the situation that we're in.
yeah.
And so, so we relegate the repugnant conclusion to a repugnant appendix, and say that, if you want to worry about this question because you care about dotting your I's and crossing your T's of formal population axiology, then, let's go. But
Yeah.
but if you don't, then our understanding of the facts, and not just our understanding of the facts, but the sort of economic profession's understanding of scale effects and the long term impact on living standards of more people having more ideas, and the fact that other people wanting and eating what you want to eat makes you more likely to get it. What all that adds up to is that at least over the relevant range, a stabilized future population as opposed to a forever depopulating future population would be better off per person. Now,
Yes.
if I were giving this in an audience, somebody would raise their hand and say, but surely we couldn't sustain a population of, 300 billion people on Earth at a given time. And, probably not with any technology that I know about. But that's also not what I'm saying, right? Like what I'm saying is that these are reasons to think that a population that's stabilized, maybe even at some level lower than today's, like 6 billion or 5 billion, I don't know, would be better per person than one that's shrinking generation after generation. And so one of the things that, if you're truly and only focused on the axiological questions of the repugnant conclusion, then that's going to just be irrelevant to you. But it might sort of be orienting to think that this question of a macro level quantity quality trade off probably isn't the question that we face.
Can I make I would like to make a clarion call for any philosophy PhD students out there listening. So I love this idea that there's like the kind of environment of like overpopulation worries that Parfit's repugnant conclusion gets going in. And I think that we need to have a similar kind of ethical efflorescence in light of the actual facts that we're now finally learning. And, there's one book that I think has really started this. I don't know if you've come across this Samuel Scheffler's book, Death and the Afterlife from 2016.
Yes, I sort of know it. Like I saw him give a talk, and I've sort of seen it reflected in Anastasia Berg and Rachel Wiseman's recent book of What Are Children For? So yeah, I sort of know it. But yeah.
But, it gives a kind of all or nothing version of the spike, where it's like, rather than the spike, it's just like a cutoff. It's like, what if you find out that
And tell me if this is right. Like I understand that like it's kind of not about like the externalities of like other people's lives are good for them, but rather about like if we were living in a world where we knew there wouldn't be another generation, then that would be, in a pretty empirical way, destructive of a lot of the projects and sources of value that we care about. That would make it hard for us to have good lives.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you could think of it as externalities, where like it's if people keep the tradition going that
Hmm.
I helped start.
Hmm.
That means a lot to
But the
me.
externalities of the future generation on me. So it's
Right,
sort of
right,
back
right.
to Caldwell's wealth flows again. I need other people not to pay for my pensions, but so that I can have the project of writing a book and thinking they'll read it.
Yes, the utility flow. Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. That's it. And, but for Scheffler, as you said, it's like it's just a cutoff, right? There's just no more people. But I think what you're pointing out is there's like a gradient. There's just going to be
Mm.
fewer people, right?
Right.
As I feel like we need to have some kind of ethical
Mm-hmm.
reflection on not the all or nothing problem, but the kind of more or less problem. Like if there's a
Right.
lot
Right. Right.
less
Right. Right.
humanity in
Yeah.
the
Yeah. Yeah.
future, that
I mean, like at just sort of like a dumb level, right? Like if I'm in like Burlington, Vermont, and I want to get to like across Lake Champlain to somewhere in upstate New York, right? If I believe there are going to be enough future people to finance a bridge, then I get to take a bridge. Like then
yeah,
the government will build a bridge, right? And like if you don't think that the public finance if that's going to work out, then you get to drive all the way around. And so yeah, it doesn't have to be about the loftiest things of who's going to read my book.
yeah, yeah. And it also I don't think it even has to be individualist, right? Because a lot of if you talk like linguists or something, they are very concerned about like the diversity of human languages. And I don't think it takes much to be concerned about the diversity of, human cultures and cuisines and music and all this great stuff. But you cannot have that level of diversity and specialization. I mean, this is in the book too, in certain respects, but you can't have that level of diversity in a population of 100 people,
Right.
right?
Well, I mean, so I've been interviewed on a few NPR things, and I like to say, like, let's take the case of NPR, right? So, if there were, they have, they spend about $300 million a year, and there are about 300 million Americans, about $1 per person. Of course, people don't all contribute per person, but if there were, twice as many people downloading the programs twice as fast, like they're not going anywhere, right? Like it wouldn't get used up. You could just download it, right? But if there were only half as many people or third as many people to sort of pay for these things to exist, then there wouldn't be as much. There wouldn't be as much. You wouldn't be able to find as likely to find the niche thing that works for you. And I guess part of what you're bringing up by linking it to Seffler is that I've been sort of thinking of it as like people alive at the same time as you. But there's also a sort of an intertemporal dimension where a lot of these costs can be paid for by future generations and past generations, right? So the fact that it was worth somebody's while there's like worth Agatha Christie's while to write all of these, Miss Marple mysteries means because she thought there'd be an audience means that I get to read them today. And if there hadn't been as many people back in Agatha Christie's day, then I wouldn't be able to read Miss Marple today.
Totally. And, this collective efforts like opening a museum or, trying to keep a language alive or, putting out a TV show. And, I mean, so much stuff gets just totally drained of meaning if there's not that intertemporal connection.
Yeah.
Where it's like what we're doing just has no resonance. I'm going to show the diagram. Uh,
Okay.
you know, if we live in a world where the
Yes.
population has has plummeted, then all the signals that you send out in the world just have much less to resonate through, and the meaning of your actions gets just muted a lot. So I found it in a way the book going back to whether it's optimistic or pessimistic. I found it one of the most uplifting things I've read in so long because it really it makes you just think like people are precious.
Mm.
We should be very
Yeah.
glad that you mentioned the Ehrlich quote, people, 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 like there's this
People,
nasty
people, people.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Perfectly said. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that is one of the things that we're trying. I mean, we haven't talked about this in this call, and thank goodness. I don't even know why I'm going to do this. So, like, what everybody else would like to talk about is sort of U.S. politics and sort of Whether this means JD Vance is right about everything. No, for two reasons. One, we're not talking about a naturalist story about just the United States, and two, rolling back the gender revolution is not going to be a solution. We need to make things better for parents, women, and men, and share the burdens. And perhaps if we all along had more of us thought that care work were important work, including men, we wouldn't be facing this problem. So, setting aside JD Vance, um, like, where was I? What were we? Oh my gosh! See, this is
No, we're talking about
the
intertemporal.
lie.
Yeah.
What?
Sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, 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 no. I lost it.
Oh, you've been going solid for like an hour, 20 minutes. So it was like the intertemporal stuff, or meaning, or why.
Oh yeah, right. Okay. So the sort of folks who one of the points we're trying to make is that other people are win-win.
Yes.
Yes, and I think that is something that the political tribe that doesn't sign up with JD Vance can get behind more often, whether it's about other people are win-win on immigration, or other people are win-win on international trade, other people are win-win on letting scientists work across borders, other people are win-win on collaborating to solve our climate challenges. But I think it becomes harder for people to see that other people are win-win when it comes to just living instead of never being born. And so part of what we're trying to do is get people to expand that circle. See what I did there? To think that other people are win-win on that margin too.
Love it. Now, I keep saying I'm gonna have the subscriber question. So can I? I'll close
Sure.
with
Yeah.
this. Got a
Yeah.
few more minutes. Thank you. So, uh, Liam Baldwin asked, considering that past coordination problems were often solved with innovation, might the absolute size of the prime age population be the most important factor here for growth and prosperity, as well as reversing demographic decline itself? If that's true, wouldn't it shorten the window to reverse such trends? Insofar as populations are still growing, they're also getting older on average.
Mm. Okay, so let me see if I understand the question. So it's like, let's say that we like really, so this are saying, I believe Paul Romer and Chad Jones and such that we need people to solve problems, right? Okay, sentence one. Sentence two, um, you know, um, not knowing how to construct a future where more people feel like they have the resources and support they need to choose more people is one such problem, right? Sentence three, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Um,
And
so interesting. Yeah. Mm.
Chris Simpson also asks, he says the early signs, there's like a worry about gerontocracy, where if you got low birth rates and an aging population, and there's this problem, we need to have more people, but one portion of society, the elderly, uh, may not have as much of an interest.
Right. This is something that my co-author Mike sometimes says, and that
Hmm.
that one thing our book doesn't have as much about the age pyramid as other books about low birth rates do.
Right.
Things about Social Security and such, in part because we just sort of feel like that's covered. But one element of this is voting, and older people tend to vote differently than younger people do. And so, if older people vote to allocate all the resources to older people, as opposed to 42-year-old dads, then that could make this problem either harder to solve, or it could at least mean that we're fighting over a smaller pie. So yeah, I do think that's a concern worth asking. I think both of these are concerns worth asking. Yeah, I mean, so like, and what they both point to is um, sort of if you were already thinking you were on the fence about whether sustained depopulation was a likely future, both of these questions point towards further reasons to think that sustained depopulation is a likely future in the absence of other considerations.
Makes perfect sense. One last question. This is from Barry Lamb. I don't know if you've heard of Hi-Fi Nation, but he has this great podcast. And so he heard Dean on the Singer podcast. Very good stuff. And he asks, given the evidence that you've seen in India, do you think it's likely that we'll have a replacement rate, um, like voluntarily chosen,
Hmm.
if we have a world of universal good health care, adequate nutrition, women's education, high infant survival, and reproductive choice? Because these all seem like non-negotiable things. So if we're not going to have replacement rate 2.0,
Hmm.
uh, don't we just have to sort of manage the
Mm.
decline because those are non-negotiable?
I don't know that I fully understand the question. Is it about like how are we going to achieve good lives for people if birth rates get too low, or how are we going to get birth rates higher? Could you just help me a
Yeah,
little bit more? You know.
I, I may be extracting the query from the comment a little bit. So I
Mhm.
think it's something like, you know, is the birth rate even going to be a policy question? I mean, maybe to
Mhm.
put it another way, if we need to have if we need to have all these good things that cause the birth rate to fall,
Mhm. Mhm.
what
Oh,
about, is it
I see.
possible we just have to accept that like it's not going to go up? We're not going to stabilize.
So maybe the concern is low birth rates are the inevitable consequence of sort of good lives, or at least good enough life. Like, I mean, one of the things that I think is that lives could be a lot better than they are now, even for very lucky and privileged people like me. But low birth rates are, one might worry, the inevitable consequence of good enough. And so just like somebody might say, listen, buddy, we're going to have climate change because there's no way to avoid climate change and still have global poverty reduction and good lives for people around the world. So, what we need to do is accept the fact that we're going to burn every fossil fuel we can find. Somebody might similarly say, you know, look, not creating better lives in Uttar Pradesh is not something that we consider a good option, no, a choice-worthy option. And so we're, going to have global depopulation. Let's please pivot the conversation to what's next. And you know, I guess I guess the way that I restated it sort of suggested my answer. I don't think that's the end of the conversation about climate change. And I don't think that's the end of the conversation about low birth rates either. Rather, I think we need to find ways to aspire, bigger and different. We wouldn't have written this book if we didn't think that there was some hope or optimism that if we start talking now about this challenge that we might turn the corner 6 decades in the future, then we could. And if we didn't think there was some hope that if we start talking now, we might find a solution, might find new or multiple solutions and different ways to do things. And it goes back to this being so new. I mean, I think, on the question of climate change, if so the UN projects the size of the world population to peak about 6 decades from now. About 6 decades ago, there were definitely people who knew about the climate challenge. I mean, the original like chemistry computations of Arrhenius were even before then. LBJ gave a speech in the '60s about burning fossil fuels as a pollutant, warming the earth. So, if I had been on whatever they had for Substack videos then and said, it's 1960 something and, climate change is coming, what we need to do is completely eliminate the internal combustion engine tomorrow, then I would have, been laughed out of the room and that would have been the end of it. Nobody would have taken it seriously because that wasn't a serious suggestion. But where we are now, 6 decades later, we have more options. The end of internal combustion engines is something that my kids, if not me, might live to see, and that's because over these decades, we've had more science, we've had more social movements, had more political movements. We have journals like Nature Climate Change and university departments, and so we know so much more and have built so much more since then. And so similarly, over the next 6 decades or whatever it is, other people would put it sooner, we can and should learn more and get that process started now, which is, it's disappointing to get to the end of something like this and have the so-called experts say, I don't have all the solutions. You know, what are we here for? But what we're here for is to get started. And I think that, you know, over the coming decades, we're going to learn more than we know now.
I can't think of a better note to end on. This is Dean Spears, After the Spike with Mike Russo. Please, I highly recommend you get the book. And Dean, before you go, can I get you know, some podcasts that they ask for like what are some books you recommend? But I think academic articles are kind of underrated. Uh,
Okay.
is there an academic article, not that you recommend, but just one that you like, one that you really
Mhm.
love? It could be as nerdy as you want.
Okay, here's what I'm going to do. Uh, Bill England's 1977 paper on the repugnant conclusion that notes there's something similar under averagism and totalism that is a big part of what, you know, this sort of a similar thing to what Mark B. Dolphin and I talked about in our paper. It's also part of the appendix that, you know, I, I don't get why that and the Ung paper um, 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 really weren't seen by more people to have importantly settled these questions. So I will I will say that. And if you want a book,
Sure.
The Digger and the Duckling.
Dean, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.